Welcome to Urban American Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The deafening sound of demolition echoed through the darkness of the night, waking Christopher Stevens from his sleep. His eyes opened instantly, and his heart raced as he recognized the unmistakable sound of crumbling metal and concrete. Living on his private island in Lake Norman, North Carolina, Chris knew that any structural alteration to his property wasn't just unwanted, it was illegal. Through the security cameras installed on his tablet, the scene unfolding was surreal. Diana Wallace, the president of the Lakeside Gardens Homeowners Association, was standing on the shore of the mainland, gesticulating frantically as a demolition crane attacked the only bridge connecting her island to the rest of the world. Beside him, Bruce Parker, his faithful assistant, was coordinating the operation with a walkie-talkie, giving instructions to the machine's operator. "Damn it!" Chris cursed hastily, putting on a coat over his pajamas. He ran out of his three-story colonial house across the meticulously tended garden that his late wife Margaret loved so much. The cold October air cut across his face as he approached the shore of his island, only to witness the last moments of his bridge being reduced to rubble. "Diana!" he shouted across the water. "Stop this immediately!" Diana Wallace, a middle-aged woman with perfectly groomed gray hair and an impeccable business suit, even at that time of night, just smiled. "I'm sorry, Mr. Stevens, but your bridge does not comply with the new HOA regulations. As president, I have a duty to ensure that all structures in our community follow the established standards." Anger bubbled up inside Chris as he watched Gary Thompson, the local builder, maneuver the crane. Gary was known in the area for taking on questionable jobs as long as the pay was good. "Gary, do you realize what you're doing? This is destruction of private property." The builder hesitated for a moment, but a firm nod from Diana made him continue. Chris quickly grabbed his cell phone and started filming, documenting every second of the madness. As a retired lawyer specializing in real estate law, he knew exactly the legal weight of those images. "This is completely illegal, Diana," Chris shouted again. "You have no authority to demolish a structure on private property without a court order or my consent. I'll sue you for every last penny." Bruce Parker, a thin man with thin-framed glasses and a perpetually anxious expression, whispered something in Diana's ear. She just shrugged her posture, emanating a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Do what you think is best, Mr. Stevens. But remember, you agreed to our terms when you bought your property." What Diana didn't know was that Chris had spent the last few months meticulously documenting each of his petty tyrannies against the residents of Lakeside Gardens, from absurd fines for slightly different shades of paint, then approved to threats of foreclosure for minimal late payments. Diana had built a reign of bureaucratic terror around the lake. As he watched the last pieces of his bridge disappear into the dark waters of the lake, Chris felt a growing determination. His island had been the refuge he and Margaret had chosen for their retirement, a place where they could enjoy peace and quiet. After losing Margaret to cancer the previous year, that island had become more than just a piece of property. It was the last tangible connection to his beloved wife. The next morning, Chris woke up early and called his old law firm. Rachel Martinez, a promising young lawyer he had mentored, picked up on the first ring. "Rachel, I need your help. It's time we taught Diana Wallace a lesson." "Finally!" Rachel exclaimed. "I've been gathering evidence against her for months, ever since you told me about your suspicions. I have statements from at least a dozen homeowners who were victims of her bullying tactics." Chris smiled for the first time since the night before. "Good. Prepare the documents for a class action. I'll send you the videos of the demolition and all the evidence I've collected. But first, I need to sort out my immediate situation. I'm practically stuck on an island." while organizing a temporary boat service to access his property. Chris received an unexpected message from Gary Thompson. The builder was willing to testify about the explicit instructions he had received from Diana to carry out the demolition at night, away from the eyes of the other residents. The upcoming legal battle promised to be epic. Chris knew that Diana had important political connections in the town of Davidson, but he had something more valuable: the documented truth and a lifetime of experience in real estate law. As he watched the sun rise over the lake, reflecting on the wreckage of his bridge, Chris made a silent promise to Margaret. "I won't let them destroy our dream, honey. This island represents everything we've built together, and I'm going to fight for it until the end." News of the overnight demolition spread quickly through the lakeside gardens community. Other owners, long intimidated by Diana's authoritarian regime, began to speak out. What began as an act of vandalism against private property was about to turn into a larger movement, a battle for every homeowner's right to live in peace in their own home. The morning after the demolition, Chris was sailing in a small rented boat towards the mainland when he noticed unusual movement near the wreckage of the bridge. A group of residents were gathering on the shore, including Martha Delacroix, a retired university professor who lived 2 houses down from Diana Wallace's property. "This is an outrage," Martha gestured emphatically to the other residents. "First it was the absurd fines for my unregulated rose bushes, and now this Diana has gone too far." Chris moored the boat and joined the group. Among those present was also Harold Chen, a respected architect who had tried unsuccessfully to challenge Diana's arbitrary decisions on modifications to his historic home. "Mr. Stevens," Harold greeted him, "we were just discussing how we can help. I have all the original plans for your bridge approved 5 years ago by the Davidson City Council. And I have records of all the HOA meetings from the last 3 years. Martha added, her eyes shining with determination, "including the one where Diana tried to pass a resolution to prohibit access to private islands without prior approval from the association." The motion was unanimously rejected. Rachel Martinez arrived at that moment carrying a briefcase full of documents. Her impeccable suit contrasted with the warlike expression on her face. "Good morning, everyone. Chris, we need to talk about something interesting I've discovered. It seems that our dear Diana has a rather controversial record in other housing associations." The group made their way to the local cafe, the Lake House, where the owner, Sandra Mitchell, readily offered the back room for the impromptu meeting. Sandra had her own issues with Diana, who constantly threatened her establishment with alleged zoning violations. Diana worked in 3 other HOAs before Lakeside Gardens, Rachel explained, spreading documents out on the table. In all of them, there were accusations of mismanagement of funds and misuse of authority. She always resigned before any formal investigation could be completed. Chris nodded, absorbing the information. "That explains why she acts with such confidence. She has practice in escaping the consequences." "But not this time," Harold interjected. "I have a contact in the town planning department who confirms there has been no application for permission to demolish the bridge, which means that Diana not only violated property rights, but also municipal laws." At that moment, Gary Thompson entered the cafe looking nervous and out of place in his dusty work uniform. "Mr. Stevens, can I talk to you for a minute?" The group watched as Chris and Gary moved away to a more private table. "Look," Gary began, twisting his cap between his hands. "I know I did something wrong last night. Diana offered me an exclusive contract for all HOA work if I did the job without question. But I can't live with that guilt." Chris studied the builder's face for a moment. "Gary, are you willing to testify about this?" "Yes, sir. And there's more. She asked me to forge some retroactive permit documents. I have everything saved, including the emails. Rachel, who had approached, silently smiled. Mr. Thompson, you've just significantly strengthened our case. The meeting went on for hours, with more residents arriving to hear the news. Jennifer Patel, a local investigative journalist, offered to cover the story, focusing especially on the HOA's pattern of abusive behavior under Diana's leadership. But we need to act fast, Chris warned the group. Diana is certainly already mobilizing her political contacts, and I still need a temporary solution to access my property. Harold raised his hand. I can help with that. I have a preliminary design for a temporary floating bridge that meets all the regulations. We can have something installed in 48 hours if we can get emergency approval. Leave that to me, Jennifer offered. I know people in the mayor's office who would be very interested to know about Diana Wallace's unauthorized nocturnal activities. As the group dispersed each with their assigned tasks, Chris realized that he was no longer alone in this battle. Diana's tyranny had inadvertently created something she never intended: a community united against the abuse of power. Back on his island, watching the sun set over the calm waters of the lake, Chris found an old photo of Margaret in his office. In it, his wife was smiling next to the newly built bridge holding the original plans. You always said that the good people outweigh the bad, dear, he murmured to the photograph. I guess you were right as always. His phone rang. It was Rachel with more news. Chris, you won't believe what I just found out about the HOA's finances. Rachel's discovery about the HOA's finances turned out to be a ticking time bomb. Analyzing the financial records for the last 3 years, she found a disturbing pattern of accounting deviations and manipulations that made Diana Wallace's actions seem even more sinister. You're not going to believe this, Chris, Rachel explained during an emergency video conference. Diana has been using a front company to overprice maintenance services. The company Lakeside Maintenance Solutions is registered in Bruce Parker's name, but the payments go straight to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Chris leaned back in his chair, watching through the window the movement of the boats that were now crossing between his island and the mainland. That explains why she was so desperate to demolish my bridge. I was starting to ask questions about the maintenance costs of the structure. Harold Chen joined the virtual conversation, sharing his screen with new documents. There's more. I analyzed the contracts for the last major construction projects approved by the HOA. They were all awarded to companies linked to the same group. And guess what? Gary Thompson was about to become one more in their network of manipulated contractors. Martha Delacroix, who had become a tireless investigator, came up with her own revelations. I found something interesting in the archives of the municipal library. Before becoming president of the HOA, Diana worked as a consultant for a developer who is trying to buy several properties around the lake, including your island, Chris. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Jennifer Patel, who was silently taking notes, intervened. Lakeside Development Corporation. I've heard of them. They have a billion-dollar project to turn the whole area into a luxury resort, but they need 100% of the owners to agree to sell. And what better way to force people to sell than to make their lives a living hell? Chris concluded, feeling his blood boil. Margaret's memories of how they had chosen that island specifically for its privacy and tranquility made his resolve grow even stronger. Sandra Mitchell, who had made her cafe available as the operations headquarters, brought a new perspective. Have you noticed that all the homeowners who have refused to sell their houses in the last 2 years have suffered some kind of harassment from the HOA? Rachel began to list the incidents. The Hendersons were repeatedly fined for landscaping irregularities until they sold. The Rodriguez family faced threats of foreclosure for manufactured delays. And now, Chris has his bridge demolished. We need more hard evidence, Chris mused. something that links Diana directly to the developer. As if answering his prayers, Bruce Parker chose that moment to have a crisis of conscience. He sent a message to Chris requesting a private meeting away from Diana's watchful eyes. The meeting took place at the municipal pier where Bruce arrived visibly nervous. "Mr. Stevens, I can't take it anymore. Diana is using me as an orphan in her operations, but she's also blackmailing me. I have documents, emails, contracts, everything that proves the scheme with the developer." "Why are you telling me this now, Bruce?" "Because she crossed a line with the demolition of your bridge. And because—" He hesitated. "Because I found out that she plans to use my signature on documents that would incriminate me if something goes wrong. I'm the perfect scapegoat." Jennifer, who was watching discreetly from afar, recorded the entire conversation. With Bruce's testimony, Gary Thompson's evidence, and the financial records discovered by Rachel, they finally had a solid case. But Diana Wallace was not someone who gave up easily. That very night, all the members of the group received notices from the HOA, alleging various violations and threatening astronomical fines. "She's desperate," Rachel analyzed during an emergency meeting. "That just proves we're on the right track." Chris observed the group gathered in his living room, now only accessible by boat. Each face reflected determination and unity against a common enemy. "Diana doesn't realize that her every action only makes us stronger," he commented. Martha raised her teacup in a wry toast. "To Diana Wallace, who unwittingly created the most united resistance movement Lakeside Gardens has ever seen." The collective laughter was interrupted by an alert on Jennifer's cell phone. "Guys, you need to see this. The Lakeside Development Corporation has just announced a press conference for tomorrow. They're going to unveil their revolutionary plans for the area." "Perfect," Chris smiled. "How about we give them a surprise?" The group spent the whole night preparing their strategy. As Diana Wallace prepared for her moment of triumph, she had no idea that her carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse. The Lakeside Development Corporation press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the luxurious Davidson Grand Hotel. Diana Wallace arrived an hour earlier, impeccable in her navy blue suit, rehearsing her triumphant speech alongside smiling executives. What she didn't expect was to find Chris Stevens and his team already positioned in the front row of the auditorium. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her face momentarily losing its rehearsed composure. Chris smiled serenely. "As an owner affected by the revolutionary plans, I thought it appropriate to participate, especially considering certain information that has come to my attention." Before Diana could respond, Jennifer Patel entered, accompanied by a crew from WCNC-TV, Charlotte's largest local broadcaster. Other reporters began to arrive, attracted by an anonymous communiqué about possible irregularities in the project. Lakeside Development CEO Maxwell Richardson III took the stage at precisely 10 a.m. "Ladies and gentlemen, today is a historic day for Lake Norman. We are on the verge of transforming this region into a world-class tourist destination." Impressive. Slides showed renderings of luxurious resorts, golf courses, and exclusive marinas. Chris's Island, in particular, was set to become a luxury spa with panoramic views of the lake. "Naturally," Richardson continued, "we have already secured the cooperation of the local homeowners association, brilliantly represented by Ms. Diana Wallace, who has been instrumental in setting the stage for this transition." Rachel Martinez chose this moment to stand up. "Mr. Richardson, could you explain the exact nature of this cooperation, particularly the payments made by Lakeside?" "Development to Lakeside Maintenance Solutions." Richardson's smile faltered. Diana started frantically signaling from the side of the stage, but it was too late. "I have here," Rachel continued, handing out folders to the journalists present, complete documentation showing how Ms. Wallace has systematically harassed homeowners who refuse to sell using her position in the HOA to create untenable situations. Bruce Parker, sitting quietly in the back of the auditorium, stood up. I can confirm these allegations. As a former assistant to Ms. Wallace, I participated in these operations under coercion and threats. Chaos ensued in the auditorium. Jennifer Patel, in her element, began a live broadcast. We are witnessing serious charges of conspiracy and fraud involving one of the largest real estate projects ever proposed for Lake Norman. Diana tried to leave the stage, but was intercepted by two FBI agents who had been undercover in the audience. Ms. Wallace, one of them announced, we'd like to ask you a few questions about certain international financial transactions. Chris watched the scene unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. There was no pleasure in seeing someone brought down, but Diana had chosen her path. Martha Delacroix approached him with a gentle smile. Margaret would be proud, Chris. You didn't just defend your property, you protected our entire community. Harold Chen joined them, holding up his tablet. I already have 3 companies interested in rebuilding your bridge, Chris. This time, let's make sure it's even stronger and more beautiful than the last one. The news of Diana Wallace's arrest and the collapse of Lakeside Development's project spread quickly through the community. Over the next few days, an extraordinary transformation began to take place in Lakeside Gardens. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other began to come together, sharing stories of bullying and supporting each other. Sandra Mitchell turned her cafe into an informal community center where residents met to discuss the future of the association. We need to rebuild the HOA from scratch, she declared during one of these meetings, with transparency, democracy, and mutual respect. For Chris, watching all this from his temporarily isolated island, there was a sense of completion approaching. The bridge that Diana had destroyed would be rebuilt, but something more important was being built, a true community founded on trust and mutual respect. Rachel entered her office with another folder of documents. Chris, we found something interesting in the HOA's old records, something that could ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. The evening light reflected off the waters of the lake, and Chris could swear he saw Margaret's smile in the small ripples on the surface. The battle wasn't completely over, but the tide had finally turned. The Davidson County courtroom was packed on the morning of the trial. Chris Stevens adjusted his tie, sitting next to Rachel Martinez, as he watched Diana Wallace enter, escorted her usual air of superiority, replaced by a tense expression. All rise, announced the officer as Judge Catherine Blackburn entered the room. The criminal case against Diana was running in parallel, but this civil hearing would determine the future of Lakeside Gardens and its governance. Rachel stood up first. Your Honor, the case before us today goes far beyond the illegal demolition of a bridge. It represents a systematic pattern of abuse of power, financial manipulation, and coercion that has affected dozens of homeowners in our community. The next 2 hours were a meticulous exposition of evidence. Gary Thompson described in detail Diana's instructions for the nighttime demolition. Bruce Parker, now fully cooperating with the authorities, presented documents linking Diana to Lakeside Development Corporation through offshore accounts. Martha Delacroix testified about years of harassment of owners who refused to sell. She turned our lakeside paradise into a police state where even the color of the curtains could result in astronomical fines. During the break, Chris found Harold Chen reviewing the designs for the new bridge. We got emergency approval, Harold whispered. Construction can start next week, and this time I've included structural elements that will make it practically indestructible. When the court reconvened, Diana finally had her chance to speak. Everything I did was for the good of the community, she declared, her voice trembling slightly. Lakeside Gardens needed modernization, higher standards. How can you illegally demolish the only access route to a resident's property? Judge Blackburn interrupted her tone, making her incredulity clear. Jennifer Patel, sitting in the gallery, was typing furiously on her laptop, documenting every moment. Her series of reports on the case had already gained national attention, exposing abusive practices by HOAs across the country. The judge's decision was unequivocal. Diana Wallace was permanently removed from any position in the HOA, ordered to repay all embezzled amounts, and pay substantial damages to the aggrieved homeowners. Lakeside Development Corporation would face its own legal consequences in a separate proceeding. Most importantly, Judge Blackburn concluded, I order the immediate dissolution of the current HOA board and the holding of new elections under judicial supervision. The association should adopt new bylaws that ensure transparency and expressly limit its powers over private properties. When Chris left the courthouse, he found a crowd of neighbors waiting. Sandra Mitchell was handing out coffee from her food truck parked in front of the building. I thought we could celebrate, she smiled. Actually, Chris replied, I have a better idea. How about we use my island for a community celebration as soon as the new bridge is ready, of course. In the weeks that followed, Lakeside Gardens experienced a remarkable transformation. The new HOA, led by a rotating board of residents, focused on building community rather than imposing rules. Martha Delacroix started a community garden project, Harold Chen offered free consulting for home improvements, and Sandra turned her cafe into a true community center. On the day of the new bridge's inauguration, Chris was standing on the same spot where months earlier he had watched helplessly as the old structure was destroyed. The new construction was a masterpiece of engineering and aesthetics, with solar lighting and a small gazebo in the middle for residents to enjoy the sunset. Margaret would love this, he muttered to himself, touching the newly installed railing. Rachel approached, carrying a briefcase. I've got some interesting news, Chris. Remember those old documents we found? Well, they resulted in new state legislation. The Lakeside Property Protection Act will limit the powers of HOAs throughout North Carolina. So our little battle is going to help other people? Chris smiled. More than you know, Jennifer joined the conversation. I'm getting messages from homeowners all over the country. Your case is inspiring similar changes in other states. The bridge's inauguration party turned into a celebration of the RET reborn community. Children ran around the new deck, residents shared stories, and food and plans for the future were discussed with enthusiasm and optimism. Chris watched it all from his favorite vantage point on the bridge. The island he and Margaret had chosen as a refuge now symbolized something greater, a beacon of hope for people fighting against the abuse of power in their own communities. You know, Martha commented, joining him with a glass of wine, sometimes the worst storms bring the best changes. The sun was setting over Lake Norman, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. On the opposite shore, Diana Wallace's old house displayed a for sale sign. The news of her criminal conviction had arrived earlier that day. She was facing years in prison for fraud and conspiracy. To our community, Chris raised his glass, surrounded by his new friends and allies. And to the reminder that when good people unite, no tyranny, however small or large, can prevail. The last rays of sunlight sparkled on the waters of the lake, as if nature itself were celebrating the victory of justice and the rebirth of a true community.